Okay, welcome to Micro Lecture 7.2. I know I ran a little long in the last one, so I'll try to make this one a little shorter. Like I said, I like to try to keep my time between 5 and 10 minutes. And we're going to talk about the fight to control the bench in this micro lecture. This is really about the fight to control the Supreme Court of the United States, and to a lesser extent, we could talk about the fight really to control the entire judiciary and how important that is and how it's kind of changed. So let's jump in. What does the Constitution say? Because that's got to be our starting point. Here is a direct quote, and this is from Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2, United States Constitution. And I included everything up to the important points. He, meaning the President, shall have the power, comma, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, comma, provided 2/3 of the senators concur, semicolon, and he shall nominate, and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers, counsels, judges of the Supreme Court, and all others, officers in courts. Now what? Obviously, we have a question. What does this mean? What does, in particular, advice and consent of the Senate mean? The 2/3 provision, which I kind of clipped there because it talked about treaties, leads into it, and this asks us to consider: can the president essentially appoint anyone he wants to the Supreme Court, and can the Senate refuse even if someone is qualified, or even refuse to have a vote? So the formal process that goes by is that the president traditionally consults with the Senate, not as much for the Supreme Court, but certainly for the other courts, the Circuit Court of Appeals and the federal district courts. He often will go to the sitting senator, particularly from his own party, and say, do you have anybody you would recommend I should appoint? For the Supreme Court, he pretty much, at least lately, gets a list, usually from a group or groups or individuals that support his political position, and then selects from that list. So sometimes you hear them say he's at the top of the list or she's at the top of the list. For example, in the last one, when we had Justices Gorsuch and Justices Kennedy, the Federalist Society, which is a conservative Republican-leaning group, was one of the ones that provided a list. The Senate, after he announces someone, so let's take for the example Senator Justice now, but Judge Kavanaugh then, he sends the nomination to the Senate Judiciary Committee, and that is composed of Republicans and Democrats. The Senate Judiciary Committee then can hold hearings. I say can because this can be a little bit contentious. When President Obama appointed somebody to the court, the Republican Senate felt that he was qualified, but they didn't want to put him on the court. So they were fearful that some Republican senators might desert or would be placed in a difficult condition where they would have to essentially vote for him even if they didn't necessarily want to. So they never held hearings in the first place. Assuming that we get over this first hurdle where we decide to have hearings, then you're going to call witnesses and hear evidence. And this, again, is under the control of the dominant political party that controls the Senate at this point. So they can limit the witnesses or limit the amount of time or limit access. So it's entirely possible that if a political party doesn't want evidence to be heard, it's not heard. They then vote in the committee whether to recommend, yes, this person should go to the full Senate to be confirmed or not. There is then a full debate in the Senate. Now, traditionally, the vote in the Senate to be confirmed to the Supreme Court and most judicial branches, judicial offices, you had to win a 2/3 majority. But that now, under something called the nuclear option, has changed to a simple majority. If you have 51 votes to 49, you're now a justice on the Supreme Court. What about qualifications? Well, traditionally, presidents would claim that they were appointing only the most qualified and distinguished members of the bar, although I will emphasize here that the Constitution does not even require a justice on the Supreme Court to be a lawyer. Now, As far as I know, everyone has been. Haven't been what I would call a practicing lawyer, but they have been. Um, Probably the most famous recent example of someone who really didn't practice, didn't come right out of the judiciary, either a former judge, former prosecutor, would be the former governor of California, Earl Warren, who was appointed way back in the 1950s by President Eisenhower, I believe. So if we are looking for a very skilled lawyer, who gets to set the criteria? Now, traditionally, we look to the American Bar Association, which is a group of all American lawyers that historically has really been the largest single group of lawyers and arguably the most influential. Lately, because some primarily Republican presidents have felt that this group is not to their liking, the American Bar Association's recommendations are not taken as seriously. Also, most justices now that the Supreme Court are coming out of the U.S. Circuit Court. They're judges that are working federally already. Very often they've worked inside administrations. So I think of the 9 justices, if I'm not mistaken, 7 of them have come out of the Circuit Court. This is also, politics is very critical. Typically, the nominee is a supporter of the president's political positions. Sometimes this can be difficult to ascertain, but particularly of late, the president seemed to be much better at deciding who is or is not a supporter of what they believe. Now, there can be other factors. You may want to appoint a certain race, a certain gender, a certain ethnic or political group you want to reward. So all those can go into it. They also can sometimes make it easier or more difficult to vote for someone. So again, those can be factors to appoint onto the court. Traditionally, regardless of who appointed a justice, they often voted against their own party. And what do I mean by this? Well, if a justice was appointed by a Democrat in the 20th century or by a Republican, it was not uncommon to see them vote against their own party. And this has a very long tradition. It goes back to cases like Dred Scott versus Sanford, which was in 1854. It goes back to a landmark case called Lochner versus New York, in which you're going to find Democrats and Republicans on opposite sides of where their party would have them. Prior to the 1990s in the United States, there's very little evidence that there was a strong party divide, partisan divide, inside the Supreme Court. That is over. If you look at how things have changed, now, you don't need to pay too much attention to where we're talking about deviations here and percentages, but essentially, if you'll notice, it was certainly possible for Democratic appointees in between 1986 and 1993 to really deviate from their party. And even Republican justices seemed to be relatively stable up to about 2004, 2005, but now, by 2015, you'll see that all of these are starting to collapse. What that means is that you can count 95% of the time for Republicans and about 96% of the time for Democrats that they're going to vote according to what you call a party line. And we're even starting to see that the clerks of the courts, the clerks are people who assist the justices, they're being drawn out of partisan groups. So it's really becoming a kind of self-perpetuating system whereby the clerks, who are often the future employees of the Justice Department, who are often future circuit judges who then become Supreme Courts, well, then they hire the conservative or the liberal clerks, and the system just reinforces itself over and over. And it has clearly become more partisan since about 1991, 1993. This has had a real dramatic impact. One of the things you can do today is you can pretty much predict how, usually 7 or 8, sometimes 9, members of the court will vote. And this is really something new, because in the past you often couldn't. And I'm going to recommend an article for you to read. It's online. It's called Split definitive, how polarization turned the Supreme Court into a partisan court. It's a fairly neutral approach. I tried to find one that was like this so that if those of you that are conservative wouldn't say, well, you know, Mr. Chapman's just pushing a conservative or liberal agenda, and those of you that are liberal wouldn't say, well, he's pushing a conservative agenda. This is, I think, a fairly balanced point of view to give you an idea how bad it is. Now, to be honest about this and forthright, there does seem to be a little bit more partisanship now, at least, on the right side than on the political left. Why is this all important? Why am I even talking about this in an introduction to criminal justice? Because the credibility of the Supreme Court rests upon the assumption that it's neutral, that it reaches its decisions based upon a fair and accurate interpretation of law, and that we can trust it. And this was very critical. I grew up in the 1960s, and the only way the Supreme Court could really affect change in the United States, because the House, the Senate, and the President really seemed incapable of doing things like passing anti-lynching laws, believe it or not, was through exercising its immense prestige to order things like desegregation. And all credit to them. However, by the year 2000, you have the infamous case of Bush versus Gore, where judges voting strictly on party lines, often, I would say, if you read the decision carefully, in opposition to their declared fundamental philosophies, and I think that was true on both sides, but particularly, again, I think it's fair to say the Republicans. There were some Democratic justices that you could argue maybe that they could have voted on Bush's side, but at least I would say 3 of the 5 Republican justices really had to change quite a bit about their philosophy and as they were expressing it in order to vote for Bush. So I will close with this thought. What is going to happen then in the future if the public loses the respect for the court, accepts the idea that the court is simply a partisan political branch of a political party, Democrat or Republican? Where is its credibility going to be? Where is its ability to really unite the country behind a decision? I think it's a very serious thing that, fortunately for me, since I'm an oldster, your generation is going to have to address. So we'll leave it there. And again, I guess I went a little over on this one. I'll try to keep it shorter in the next.